Today we are looking at the Detroit style pizza. This comes from an entire family of pizzas that are made in pans. You have the grandma style, the Sicilian pizza, and Detroit. Now, a Detroit pizza is known to be a little bit thicker than most other pizzas. Not quite as thick as a Chicago style or a focaccia, but a little more airy and fluffy, while the outside is sort of crisped by the cheese and oil that has seeped over the pan to give it that very unique crunch and then soft, airy, fluffy inside. And then oftentimes it's made upside down in terms of toppings. So instead of going your sauce, cheese, toppings, they sort of do things in reverse order. The great thing about this style is that it is very forgiving. It's all made in a pan and it's relatively hands-off. And so you can try out a number of different flours, different hydration levels. You don't really need to build up the same amount of gluten levels that you would for a Neapolitan style. And so you can sort of throw things together and see how it reacts and see what that does to your pizza. So if you're looking to try out different ways of mixing things into your pizzas, the different flours, different waters, this is the way to go. My recipe here is going to be relatively wet. Usually these pizzas are about 75% hydration. I put mine up to 85% hydration. That gives it a little bit more of a moist crust while still being thick and enough strength to give it that oven spring that Detroit is known for. When you go over 85%, I've done 100% hydration pizzas for Detroit's, and that can tend to get a little bit harder to work with. I recommend not trying that as much right now, but it is something you can do with this style. You just gotta do a little bit of a par bake, so make sure you get that oven spring so the toppings don't weigh this thing down. But let's jump right into this and start off with the dough for this pizza. Here is the baker's percentage for the Detroit pizza. The pan is about 10 inches by 14 inches, and I like to hit a final dough weight of about 650-ish grams. That will give me a nice even base on the bottom with a good amount of thickness that I associate with Detroit. Again, this is a very wet dough. With a flour weight of 350 grams, with a water weight of 297 grams, the sourdough starter of about 52.5 grams, and then we do 3% of salt for this recipe. First things first, this should look familiar. Add your starter to your water. If you're using sourdough starter, go ahead and weigh that, put that in the water. If you're using yeast, then do one big rounded teaspoon of yeast and throw that in into warm water for about 15 minutes and let that activate. If you're using sourdough starter, just go ahead and move to the next step. Go ahead and add all of your flour, all your salt, everything into a mixing bowl and run that on medium for about 10 minutes until the gluten is developed. For this, we don't need to use the double loaf flour like we did with the Neapolitan style. We don't need that finely milled, heat-resistant flour for this. In fact, this pizza is gonna cook a lot longer at a lot lower of a temperature, and because of that, we can get away with using unbleached bread flour. And this is actually the flour of choice for this kind of pizza. It's gonna give it the right kind of airiness and tenderness in that crust, but also provide enough protein to give it some gluten strength and structure, even though we're not gonna be messing with it too much. We're not gonna be kneading it as much as we are with the Neapolitan style, so we don't need to spend as much time developing that gluten structure. We're gonna let this flour do a lot of the work for us. I'm using Stone Burr unbleached bread flour, but I also use King Arthur's unbleached bread flour. Anything unbleached bread flour with a nice high 12 to 13% protein is gonna be great for this purpose. And again, you can mix your flour. Sometimes I'll do 10 to 20% of my flour with like spelt berries that have been milled up. Because again, this is all gonna be sitting in a pan. You don't have to worry about those whole grains tearing the gluten structure apart because everything's gonna be sort of localized into this pan. That'll be, again, this is a forgiving pizza, so that'll be giving you help in keeping all your pizza into one place. After about 10 minutes of rigorous mixing, you should have a well-glutened ball of very wet, very sticky dough. Use wet hands to peel that dough away from the mixing bowl and into another container. Wet hands are gonna help keep that dough from sticking to your hands too much and allow you to work with it a little bit more. Put that in a container and set that to the side for 30 minutes for resting. Now with the Neapolitan pizza, we really just used San Marzano tomatoes that were just crushed, and that was it. But for the Detroit, we really want something a little more flavorful, a little bit more hearty, something that will stand up to the rest of the flavor components of this very thick, very complex pizza. And so for that, I have a can of whole peel tomatoes that will be crushed down, a little bit of dried oregano, salt and pepper, a little bit of red chili flakes for heat, some garlic, and then I usually like to add a little bit of fresh herbs at the very end. For this, I have thyme, but you can use a little bit of parsley or a tad of rosemary if you'd like. Heat up 2 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil into a saucepan at medium heat. Add the minced garlic, dried chili peppers, and let that go just before the garlic starts to turn brown. Then add your tomatoes and dried oregano, a touch of salt and pepper, and let that simmer for about 5 to 10 minutes. We don't want this cooking too long because, again, this is gonna cook for another 15 minutes on the pizza. So really, we just wanna let these flavors sort of marry together, let everything sort of bloom, everything combine, and give that tomatoes a little bit of caramelization on the bottom. At the end, turn off the heat, add your fresh herbs, and set that into a container into the fridge and let it cool completely. So 30 minutes have passed and this dough has rested a little bit and relaxed. Now we are going to do what's called the stretch and fold technique. So with the Neapolitan, you saw me kneading the dough like crazy, but this is a much wetter, much softer dough. You can't really develop gluten in that way. There are different techniques. To do this, I'm going to use one that is sort of used in the sourdough bread making community, and that is the stretch and fold technique. What you're gonna do is wet your hand, get it wet so doesn't stick to you, grab one corner of the dough and sort of stretch it out as much as you can and then fold it over on itself. This is a much more gentler way of giving it a little bit of gluten development while laminating the dough, sort of agitating the yeast and the starter in there so that it kind of moves around and gets through the entire dough and lets it ferment in a much more even way. You're gonna do this to all four corners. I kind of move around the entire dough a couple times, and then after that, you're gonna cover it up and let it rest for another half hour. We're gonna do about 3 of these folds. I like to do about 2 to 3. Again, you don't need to develop as much gluten as you would for a pizza that's gonna be more freeform. This one needs about 2 or 3 folds every half hour, and then we can move on to the next step. As we go ahead and let this rest for another half hour, let's prepare the toppings that we're gonna use for this pizza. As you can see, I have 4 different toppings here for my typical Detroit style pizza. I have 2 different cheeses, a touch of Calabrian chili peppers, and then I have sopressata here. You can use pepperoni, which I think is more typically used, but I like the taste of sopressata. To talk about the cheeses for a minute, because cheese is a big thing with Detroit pizza. It usually uses a little bit of mozzarella and then what's called Wisconsin brick cheese. It's like a high-fat cheese. You can find it online. It's a little tough to find elsewhere in California. I'm in California. You can't really find it at a store, so you can order it. I don't like to do that. I like to just substitute it out. It's hard. It's a hard cheese to substitute because it melts and crisps up in a very specific way. But I found that using a high-fat cheese like a white cheddar here can kind of do the trick. And you can use like a Monterey Jack or Munster, but I like using this local creamery's white cheddar. So I got a block of that. I got low moisture mozzarella, which is a more mild cheese. So I got my mild, I got my sharp. And then I have these 2 here. And we're gonna cut these in a very specific way. It's not gonna be shredded or peeled real thin the way we do with a normal pizza pie that cooks in like 7 to 8 minutes. This pizza is gonna take a little bit longer, and so we're gonna cut these in a couple different ways. For the low moisture mozzarella, we are going to cut this thin slices. And then for the high-fat cheese, in this case the cheddar or your Wisconsin brick, we're going to cut these into small, like a 1/4 to 1/2 inch cubes. I will explain why you are going to do that later on. For the sopressata, I'm going to cut this at like a medium thin thickness, 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch. And then for the Calabrian chilies, I'm really just going to dabble that on. So you should notice that after your 3rd stretch and fold that the dough is much more easy to work with. It's a little billowy, it peels off the sides of the container a little bit more. You can fold it a little more gently. It's really sort of, there's a lot of gas in it, so you want to be kind of careful at this point. And what you do after that 3rd fold is you take your Detroit pan and put a little bit of olive oil at the bottom of it. You want to coat the entire bottom, the entire sides, everything with olive oil, and just sort of dump your dough into the middle, make it like a ball, and stretch it out just a little bit. The idea is you're going to let this rest for more than an hour. I mean, you can come back in an hour or 2. Maybe or 3, because you're gonna let this ferment overnight. And so really you're just letting the dough relax and rest so that you can come back to it and then stretch it out. So here it is after about an hour. My dough has been sitting in this pan. It is sort of stretched out like a pancake. It's sort of flattened out. I just wanna get my hands wet, maybe a little bit of the oil on the sides, and just stretch it out all the way. You kinda wanna dimple it to reach the corners of the pan because you want it to ferment overnight, and it's gonna grow, it's gonna bubble, and it is gonna spread out a little bit more, but you just wanna give it a little bit of help. And at the same time, sort of degas the bigger bubbles that are happening because you don't want any one area to be gassing up more than any others. You'll see that these bubbles will sort of become big tomorrow when we take a look at this again. But really what you wanna do is just get it completely covered at the bottom. So you can see I have pretty good coverage. This will fill out the rest overnight. We'll come take a look at it then. But at this point, we are pretty much done. Take some tinfoil or saran wrap, wrap it up, and place it at room temperature overnight for 12 to 16 hours. So we are at about 14 or 15 hours later for the overnight bulk fermentation. You can see that there's a lot of activity going on, a lot more bubbles, large fermentation bubbles happening. At this point, bulk is done. We can throw this into the fridge and let it cold ferment and develop more flavor for about another 24 to 48 hours if we'd like, or we can use it now. I tend to like to put this in the fridge for another day, but for this purpose, I'm gonna go ahead and start using it as is. First thing you wanna do is wet your hands and sort of degas it just a little bit. These large bubbles are gonna be problematic once I put put the toppings on, they're gonna blow out, or it's just gonna have some uneven flavoring. So you really wanna make sure you just degas it just a touch. Just get your hands wet and just dimple it a little bit as you would focaccia, just to even that dough out. This will also add some nice little pockets for the grease and the flavor to really soak up into. So first step, you don't wanna do sauce, you wanna do your pepperoni first. Now this is, you can go either way. You can do your pepperoni or sopressata on the bottom or the top, or a mix of both. I like it on the bottom because as the fat starts rendering out of that cured meat, it starts soaking it into the thickness of that crust. This crust is really great for like soaking in fats essentially. And so I like that to render down and just add a lot more flavor to the dough. If you like that kind of crispy outer rim pepperoni flavor, you can go ahead and put this on top, or you can do a little bit of both. I'm gonna put this on half the pizza because my wife does not eat pork. And so I think I'll just put it all on the bottom here. Next, you wanna go for your cheeses. Here I have the sliced mozzarella, low moisture mozzarella. I'll go ahead and place that into a thin layer on top. This is the more mild of the cheeses and sliced thin because it will melt pretty quickly if it's not covered up. Once we have that mozzarella placed, we're gonna use the star of the show, and that is our cubed high-fat Wisconsin brick, or white cheddar in my case, local white cheddar. Those cubes are gonna go everywhere on top of this pizza, especially on the edges. You want this cheese to be at the you want it touching the pan of the pizza, because as it cooks, that cheese is gonna seep down to the sides, and that's what's gonna add its signature crunch, that crisp, that fried cheese on the side of it that will sort of contrast with the fluffy, tender interior of the dough. From here, you just want to add a touch of the Calabrian chili peppers. I'm going to put it on just my side, on just the salami side here. Give it a little bit of heat, a little bit of saltiness. Now for the sauce on top. This can be weird for a lot of people. You either want to just blotch it on, or for some reason people do these like race stripes, red racing stripes for Motor City itself. So let's go ahead and give it 2 big stripes right across the top. This pizza is ready to rock and roll. If you're gonna use a home oven, that is definitely a much more safe option. Go ahead and put that thing to high heat, as high as it goes, 500, 550, and throw it into the middle rack. Once it's preheated, throw it into the middle rack for about 10 to 15 minutes. Check on the bottom, check on the crust, check on the top, move it around if needed. If the bottom's burning too fast and your heating element is at the bottom, throw something underneath like an aluminum sheet pan to sort of disperse that heat a little bit more. You sort of have to learn your oven. We talked about this in the Neapolitan episode, but you want sort of a perfect harmony of heat on all around your pizza, which makes pizza cooking a little bit more of a practice, of an art, so to speak. And so the same goes with the Detroit. There is olive oil at the bottom of this. If you remember, we lined the bottom of this pan with olive oil, and so that is gonna help assist some of the browning and the crisping. And that might work faster than you think it might. And so you wanna be cognizant of that, but also the top. You wanna make sure that Wisconsin is nice and melted in just the right way. If you're gonna use a pizza oven like I do, I have the ooni Koda 16. I have that thing preheating for about 20 minutes, getting that stone to about 800, 850 degrees Fahrenheit, getting that to sustain that heat. And then what I'm gonna do is I tend to turn the oven off completely. And at this point, it's like kind of a rotating game. I'm just moving the pan around. I'm listening for that sizzle, the olive oil, everything sort of frying on the bottom. That heat is also gonna give the dough oven spring, and so you're gonna see that rise happen almost instantaneously. The residual heat in the oven is going to cook the top of it, but at a much slower pace. And so after about 5 minutes, I feel like I'm on a pretty good place with the bottom, even though I can't see it. I'm just listening. I just by experience, about 5 minutes with that stone preheated to its fullest, and then heat off is what I found is a good spot. And then I turned the heat to ultra low, either the lowest setting, or you can go to ultra low. The ooni Koda 16 has some sort of a secret setting here. When you go past high up into towards the off mode, you can get the flame really low, and you just want to give it a nice torch on top to really cook the top of it and make sure that fried cheese on the edges is sort of browns to closer to a black. All in all, this pizza took me about 9 minutes to cook total in the ooni Koda 16, rotating constantly, keeping an eye on it that entire time. So after about 5 minutes of resting, we can go ahead and start peeling this pizza away from the pan. And I like to put it on a wire rack to let it cool and keep the bottom of it sort of aired out and crispy. Now you can see that my 85 hydration level is a little bit of like a softer crust. When you go to like 75, the recommended hydration for Detroit style pizza is just a little bit denser. But again, I just like that little extra bit of fluffiness. I think it really plays well with the rest of the contrast, and it really holds that fat well from everything going on in this pizza. So you want to be gentle as you sort of peel it off and let it cool on the wire rack. So as you can see, the sides here have a nice golden, dark brown crust on the edge of it. That's really from that cheese, a little bit of the olive oil helping with it. And it's gonna have a nice little crisp crunch to it. So as you can see on the cross section here, I got a lot of nice oven rise. That bread flour, a little bit of fermentation bubbles. It's really soft and airy, while the bottom is sort of that dark golden brown from the olive oil. The sides has like even darker golden brown from that cheese, that high fat cheese melted on it. It's insane how good this pizza is. Like the cheese is melted on top perfectly nicely, and then the flavor profile of that cheese completely changes as it drips down the side and fries up. It can become something totally different. That high fat really does something great when it gets reacted with heat. And then that rich tomato sauce with just a nice bright kick of acidity, coupled with that fat, and then the saltiness of the sopressata. And then you go into like this spongy cloud of tender goodness that then ends with a crunch at the very bottom. It's just it's a weirdly beautiful mess of flavors and textures and contrasts that just works super well together. And then at the very end, you get this nice little kick from the Calabrian chilies. Now again, this is a very indulgent pizza, especially in the way I made it. Granted, 85% water is a lot of water in this, a lot of rise, and so the thickness of it doesn't quite keep you heavy the way a Chicago pizza would. And you can modify this, put a little less cheese here and there. Again, this style of pizza is ripe for experimentation, and this is a perfect breeding ground for you to try out new ideas. And maybe healthier ones if you don't want to go full fat, lots of cheese, salamis, lots of olive oils. But this version I think is closest to what I think of when I think of a Detroit style pizza. And it is one of my favorite pizzas that I should probably limit myself to eating only once a year. Thank you guys for watching Getting Doughy with Joey. I'll see you next time. Bye.